Kia ora everybody, and welcome to another in the series of one-on-one interviews with, well, let's say housing professionals around Aotearoa, but I am hoping to widen the gambit of that to people in Aotearoa to hear what the real visceral visions for housing here are in the future. I'm Brennan Rigby, I'm the lead of the Shift Aotearoa, and all of this content can be found on our website, theshiftaotearoa.wordpress.com. And this morning I'm joined by Jill Hawkey, who I've had a preliminary conversation with yesterday, which unfortunately we didn't record because it just kind of flew off with its own wings and went in all sorts of directions. But that's okay because it's given us some good content to reflect back on today. So thanks for joining us and welcome, Jill. Thank you for joining me again. And so listen, we're going to structurally for today, we'll just let you introduce yourself and then we'll start talking about two really key things. One is your experience of COVID, and secondly, we'll start talking about your vision and your hopes for, well, let's say housing in Aotearoa, but you can take that as a code for social outcomes, social welfare, general good stuff for our society, wherever you want to take it. So without further ado, kia ora everyone, and thanks for tuning in. And Jill, would you like to take the opportunity to introduce yourself firstly?
Kia ora Brennan, and thank you for that. And I'm Jill Hawkey, I'm the director at the Christchurch Methodist Mission, and we're both a social service organisation and a community housing provider. We say that we've got services from the cradle to the grave, so we have a preschool and whānau support hub called Aratupu at the kind of cradle end. We then have various social service teams. We've got a team of workers who work in schools under the Mana Ake program. We've got social services team of social workers, psychologists and financial mentors who support families who are struggling, particularly with contracts with Oranga Tamariki and the District Health Board. And then we've got Wesley Care at the other end of life spectrum, which is a home with 108 rooms for rest home level care, hospital level care, and it's a hospice as well. So we kind of cover the cradle to the grave, but the area of our work that's grown the most in the last 5 years is housing. And we've been involved in the housing sector for many years with Wesley Village, which is out the back of Wesley Care. It's 40 units for older people, particularly targeting those without assets. So people who reach retirement, who've been in rental property all their life, who can't afford to buy something and who certainly can't afford to go into one of the new retirement villages. So that was kind of our entree into housing. And then with a grant from Rata, probably about 10 years ago now, the Methodist Mission purchased a row of 8 houses for families, 2 bedrooms, 7 of them are 2 bedroom, one's 4 bedroom, and that was our entry point into providing social housing for families. So our housing work has grown hugely over that time, but yeah, that gives you an idea. We're badly named because we're called the Christchurch Methodist Mission, but in fact we're responsible for the whole of Canterbury and Nelson, Marlborough and the West Coast. So we've got some housing services,
Wow.
and quite extensive housing services in Blenheim, a couple of workers in Nelson, and most recently we've appointed our first person in Greymouth.
I'm so glad I didn't try to introduce you myself, Jill, because I certainly couldn't have covered all of that. And here I am sitting here as the project lead of what is supposedly a systems change project, the Shift Aotearoa. And listen, the layout you've just given me of simply the organisation that you lead in terms of the number of places across the system of both our social welfare and our housing that it touches on is frankly intimidating, Jill, quite extraordinary. So kia ora and thanks for your introduction. We're going to jump into COVID, but look, I wonder if you've sort of suggested that your kind of housing, you've grown a lot in the housing space in the last 5 years, and I guess that kind of immediately puts me in mind of the Christchurch Earthquakes and the impact that they've had, especially on well, look, the social fabric, of course, but a huge housing impact, and those two things are so intertwined. Were the Christchurch earthquakes a contributor to the fact that you've seen a growth in your housing work in that period?
I think so. I think what happened in the Canterbury earthquakes was that there was a lot of attention given to homeowners and insurance. So you had different programs set up, like the temporary accommodation service and so on, for people to live while they had their own houses repaired. So there were some really good initiatives for homeowners. But I think the people who were overlooked in the earthquakes was those people who were renting, particularly those people who were renting at the lower end of the market. And what we saw over that time was that rents actually increased by 30 to 40%. So rents went up incredibly over a 2-year period. So families just got pushed out of the rental market. And what often happened for somebody who was renting was that the people who owned the house were getting repairs done to their own house, so they'd then actually give their tenants notice and move in, and while their repairs were being done. So there were a whole lot of families who were actually made homeless over that period of time, as one of the kind of knock-on effects. So you saw that happening. You saw the huge increase, because of course you had 10,000 houses that were taken out of the market. So with supply and demand, rents increased significantly. You saw a lot of families who then started, I call it double bunking, where you had one family moving in with another to try and save costs and cope with the high cost of rentals, as well as having broken houses. So a lot of people lived in broken houses for a long time with gaps in the walls, or just impossible to heat because of So
amazing.
Yeah, so that had a real knock-on effect for a lot of people.
I don't even really know where to start with that. I mean, it's I have sort of heard that the rental segment of the housing space was a little bit missed in the government's response, but I haven't had quite as visceral a description of it as that before. And so, what's the status today? Has that been resolved, or?
The increase in rentals has kind of smoothed out a bit. We've flattened the curve, as they might say. And you've still got, I think the Housing First response in Christchurch has been really interesting, because over the last 2 years, the Housing First initiative has housed over 100 people who have been homeless for over a year. And a number of those people were significantly impacted by the earthquakes, because a lot of the old boarding houses fell down or needed to be demolished post-earthquake, where a lot of those, particularly single men, who may be vulnerable because of history of alcohol, drugs, mental health issues, imprisonment, that was their home, it's where they used to live. So I think the Housing First response has really been able to address some of that and support those people into long-term permanent housing, which is great. I think one of the challenges is that as houses have been rebuilt, they tend to be in that kind of $700,000 bracket. And so therefore they need a higher return on their investment. So the number of houses either to buy or to rent at that lower end of the market just aren't there any longer. So I think that's one of the, yes, we might have the same number of houses now than we had post-earthquake, but they're in a totally different bracket. Now, your audio is totally gone, so I can't hear you at all.
That's fine. I put myself on mute because sometimes our broadband width isn't enough for these interviews. Interesting. I mean, I think in a funny kind of sort of macro systemic way, New Zealand has a similar issue, because we don't have a huge backlog of centuries of existing housing, or, that can suck up some of that demand. And you guys have got that in a very localized sense, which is a real conundrum, which I think we should pick up another time, because I'm also tempted to talk to you about what the cohort of housing need or the profile of housing needed is in Christchurch at the moment. But listen, let's pause on that and pick that up another time when we're having a more policy orientated conversation, Jill. But thanks for sending that out. Amazing picture of the circumstances, which I'm sure remain a little bit hidden, unfortunately. So look, let's move towards the subject of this interview. And I've been interviewing people about their experience of COVID, and certainly had some interesting conversations about it. So I'm interested to hear, you've got a pretty big organisation that you're leading across multiple sectors and outcomes. So what happened for you during COVID?
Well, there was two major areas of work during COVID. One was, of course, the rest home and hospital and ensuring that we kept COVID out of there. So that took a major focus of our work, just in terms of, the lockdown from visitors and how we supported families where a resident was dying. All of those, supporting staff in terms of coming to work, just trying to keep everybody safe. So that was one kind of major focus of our work. The second major focus was around people who were homeless and on the streets, and with the support of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, getting them into motels. And that was a fascinating piece of work, which we're going to get externally evaluated, which is exciting. But over the period of the lockdown, 73 households, predominantly single people, were placed into motel units for the duration of the lockdown. And the Ministry of Housing did a great job sourcing the motels, were really flexible in the way that they worked. Our workers, we borrowed the Wesley Care van because it was a good, decent-sized van, and we could practice social distancing in it. And we were able to pick up people wherever they were living or on the streets, get them to the motels, provide them with phone credit so they were able to stay in contact with our support people. And then the Housing First key workers provided the ongoing support. We provided food as necessary and just whatever it was that people were needing to be able to remain locked down during that period. So it was really exciting, and about probably a month into it, we started raising the questions about, what's going to happen with these people once lockdown ends. So we started the conversations with the Ministry of Housing. We did our assessments in terms of whether people met the Housing First criteria, and discovered that probably 2/3 of them either purely met the Housing First criteria, which means that they'd been homeless for over a year, or were in significant need of ongoing support because of their mental health or addiction issues, and they weren't going to be able to sustain a housing. And there was a small number of those, and within our Housing First contract, we've got a bit of an 80-20% rule, so 20% of the people who we take in don't have to meet that 12-month criteria, but do need to meet the, needing ongoing support. So it was 50 of those 73 we've said we can take under our Housing First contract. And of course, we've had to talk with the Ministry of Housing about increasing the volumes. Ministry of Housing's been superb. They've been really responsive in terms of what we, are trying to do. And there's been a really good trusting relationship in terms of working together. So now we're in the process. I think there's about 8 or 9 of those people who are in motels that we've been able to identify long-term permanent housing for them. And then we're working with the others as we move forward. So yeah, some really good things happened. If you'd asked me at the beginning how many people were we likely to house during that period, I probably would have said 20 or 30.
Right.
And in fact, 73 households later, yeah.
So did that involve a upscaling of your workforce? How did you manage that sort of difference in demand?
Some of it was more about shifting resources and existing resources. So all of the workforce from Housing First went home and were working from home in terms of supporting the Kaiwa, or we call them Kaiwa clients. So their existing Kaiwa, they continue to support over the phone. That saves some time in terms of travel, so it freed up some more time for some workers. And then we just diverted attention so that Nick and Anania were out on the street the whole time finding people. Deb, who's our housing specialist, did all the coordination of who was going into what motel and so on. And then the key workers then went in and were allocated a motel complex each. So yeah, they looked after a motel and whoever was actually staying in that motel at the time, and also provided support to the motelier as required.
Wow. And have Nick and Anania and Deb been given service medals and bonuses?
They did a superb job. They really did.
It's amazing. It's amazing to think of, you know, and this is something that I'd really like to see surface in our I guess, psychology about COVID and our understanding of it as we look back for all of New Zealand, which is, you know, and obviously Chris Farrelly and Julie Nelson had similar reference points of staff who literally spent the whole of the COVID-19 lockdown on the streets looking for people to help. And you know, we all know that there are essential workers, and obviously we applaud them and very thankful to them, but boy, that's a very different experience than most of us had, especially even at the level of those people and as individuals being able to engage with their own families. Did they need to isolate themselves from their own circles?
No,
and if I'm asking too many questions, feel free.
No, they didn't. They had they did have some PPE in terms of what was necessary, and just took really care of good hygiene. Yeah. Awesome.
Yep. So a couple more questions on that. I'm interested in the segue between the supply issue that you identified earlier, and you know, as I think many of us in the housing space are aware, you know, there was quickly a question about, okay, so we're actually doing a great job of getting individuals and maybe even families into motel units for the duration of this lockdown, but how do we make that sustainable? And I think most people are of the view that a motel is not a sustainable housing environment. So how is that all playing into kind of the supply issues? What kind of supply are you able to access in an environment where supply is mostly expensive housing?
Yeah. Well, Deb's job as housing specialist, her job is to spend all of her time looking for housing. So she's looking for housing, she's building relationships with landlords. Landlords have built up trust in Housing First and our responsiveness, so that they will go now and buy houses to lease to us.
Wow. Wow, really?
Yeah. So I've got, and I think a lot of that is about relationship, and it's about just building relationships of trust between our team and the landlords. We're finding exactly the same in Blenheim. Got a superb tenancy manager and housing specialist out there who's just building those relationships and saying, hey, look, this is a good deal for you as well, because we look after your house, we'll return it to you in the state which you gave it to us. We might have painted the walls a different colour, and you'll be doing some social good. So yeah, I think it's having those fabulous people, and in every house that looks like a possibility that comes up on Trade Me, Deb will be on the phone ringing and saying, would you be willing to lease this house to us? This is who we are and this is how we work. So
interesting.
Yeah,
that's amazing.
It's a hard job. But most of these people would never be able to find a house under their own steam. And the reason we can do it as Housing First is because it's the community housing provider who takes the lease and then subleases it to the person, which I think shows that we just need a whole lot more social housing out there, and housing that's built as social housing, where landlords are that much more tolerant and understanding of people's situations.
So I think I know what you're implying there, but can you talk about some of the barriers that these individuals without Housing First would be facing in terms of getting into a rental property?
Well, I guess the first thing with leasing a place from a community housing provider or from kāinga ora is that you have income related rent, and that makes such a huge difference. Even with the accommodation supplement, nothing is better than paying a quarter of your income in rent, and that's the difference between poverty and living free of poverty for many of the families we work with. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second is security of tenure, that often people in the private sector, there's just not that security of tenure long term, whereas in community housing you can stay there for as long as your family actually needs it, which provides stability. If you're talking about family housing, stability for the children, they're able to succeed educationally. It makes massive social difference if you're not always on the move. And then it's all of those little things that social landlords do to support their tenants. Like our one is, we provide skips. Twice a year we'll take a skip into our housing complex and say, if you've got any rubbish, bring it out and dump it. Because often people don't have trailers or cars big enough to take stuff to the dump, and so it ends up hanging around their houses. So it's all of those little things that social housing providers do that makes a difference.
I'm pausing, Jill, because I've never heard quite such a compelling case for the community housing provider model, and I just want to reflect it back and kind of, I'm not testing it with you, I'm just like, I want to sort of celebrate it. So the first thing you said is it was the IRRS, I think you were referring to, and you said that the subsidy which you can access by being a community housing provider tenant or by being a kāinga ora tenant can mean the difference between poverty and living free of poverty. And that's just explain what that mechanism is, could you, for a moment?
Well, if you look at one of our tenants who moved into our social housing, who previously was paying, say, $400 in rent, for their 3-bedroom house, and paying it, and they were probably getting a contribution towards it with accommodation supplement or whatever. Yep. So it might be $300 a rent that they were paying, and then were topped up by accommodation supplement. But suddenly they move into a house and they're now paying only $100 in rent because they only pay income-related rent subsidies. So they only pay 25% of their income. So suddenly they've got $200 a week more in their family's purse, and that's the difference between being able to afford new school shoes for your kids when they get holes in them or they're growing out of them. It's the difference between being able to put fruit and veggies on your family's table or decent food, or to run a car, or to get your kids to medical appointments. It's all of those things that make a difference, that difference in income when you get an income related rent. Amazing.
Thanks for that explanation. I'm quite stuck on that, but I'm going to move on to the second thing you mentioned, and there were two others. One is, and we don't need to go back over your third category, which was all of the little things that community housing providers do, because there's a lot of things in that category, and that's what we think about as wraparound services and looking after your tenant, right? But the second one you mentioned was that in community housing you have tenure security. Yeah. So can you just obviously partly for my benefit, partly for the benefit of anyone who happens to listen, why is there an issue? What's the issue with tenure security in our rental market, and how important is that?
I always use the example of one of the school principals here in Christchurch who said that every time a child moves school, they go back 6 months in their learning. And that's what the difference is for me. If we can actually enable kids to stay living in the same house, been going to the same school, then actually that's a real support to learning. And in the private sector, some private landlords are great and have got long-term interests and are really happy to provide you with long-term housing. But what we find, particularly in a place like Blenheim, that a lot of the people who end up in our transitional housing, it's been because the landlord has sold the house from underneath them. So, you know, there've been tenants in houses, the landlord has decided to cash up and do something else. You just don't have that security at all, excuse me, whether that be by a landlord selling or a landlord deciding to give you notice because they want to do something else with the house. You're actually able to make it much more your home in community housing.
Awesome. Thanks for just expanding on those 2 points a little bit for us, Jill. And thanks also for letting us know a little bit about your experience of COVID as well. I'm sure we've only really scratched the surface. And in light of only having scratched the surface, I wondered if, before we move on to talking about your sort of vision or your aspirations for housing in the future, is there anything else you'd like to share about your organisation's experience in COVID?
I don't think so. I think the only thing I'd say was it's those little things that made a difference. And the littlest thing that made a difference for us is when we learned after the earthquakes the importance of staff having laptops and docking stations and being able to pick up their laptops and go. And you've got actually everything with you there. And I had some really interesting conversations when I've put in funding proposals to the Ministry of Housing, and they say, why are you spending $2,500 on laptops? You should be able to get a PC for $1,000. And I've said, what we've learned is the importance of having something that's actually mobile. So when COVID came, all of our social services staff and our schools workers and the housing team were just able to pick up their laptops and go home and continue working as if they're at work. So again, it's those little things that make a real difference and that you learn experience after experience about. Yeah.
And unfortunately, your example is about learning from one experience for another experience, which unfortunately are both crises in this case. Earthquake, COVID-19. So that honestly, that's a nice little, I guess, an anecdote or something about how probably in many ways that we haven't really explored, but your experience as an organisation through the earthquakes probably enabled you to have a bit of an easier transition into dealing with COVID in terms of, I guess, flexibility and things. So kia ora anō, thanks for sharing all of that. And, you know, this has quickly become another interview, which I'm personally going to have to look back at to pick out all of these little gems, Jill. Really great to hear your views on these things. So let's shift focus. These interviews that I've been doing were generated by this idea of VisionWeek a couple of weeks ago now, and we've chosen to make it a bit of a staple in the diet of the Shift Aotearoa so that we can gather and share information and learn from one another in a bit more of a, maybe a bit more of a, well, I don't know, casual way, you know, no longer about sitting around a meeting table with 10 other people taking your turn, more about being able to have a good chat. So Jill, we've been through a big period of change. Where do you think that leaves us as a country, or if you'd like to talk about it at a community level, in terms of the impact it's had on our housing, let's say our housing system, however you want to read that?
The change being COVID?
Yeah.
I think it's still too early to see, you know, the long-term impacts that COVID's going to have on the housing sector. You know, we've seen some really positive things in terms of what happens to people who are homeless going into the motels. What we haven't seen is the long-term impacts of households who are going to find it hard to pay their mortgages or pay their rents because of being made redundant. And I think it's probably going to take a year or 18 months before we really start to see what that impact is. It'll be very interesting to see in you know, a place like Blenheim, which has been so reliant on migrant workers, and whether with fewer migrant workers coming into the country to pick the harvest, what impact? Obviously, it could have a positive impact on local employment, but also what's going to happen in terms of housing. Well, a lot of those workers stay in specially built RSE accommodation, which are like accommodation blocks. Some still live in large houses in Blenheim. So will that actually free up some of those large houses in Blenheim, which might help address some of the housing issues there? So, you know, I think we're still kind of in that wait and see, and it will be a while before we really see the full impact of it.
And just to unpick that a little bit, what you mentioned, RSE housing, what's that?
So RSE workers are the seasonal employment workers,
right,
who come in, particularly in Marlborough, also in the Hawke's Bay, to pick the fruit or work on the vines, do the pruning. Yeah.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
And all need somewhere to live.
Yeah, and absolutely. And Blenheim, they primarily come from Vanuatu.
Right. So we sort of touched on this a little bit yesterday in terms of an aspiration that maybe we could do a little bit of better planning for our housing futures at a regional level. So would you like to expand a little bit on your vision or your aspirations for that in the future?
Well, I think nationally we need a national housing strategy. I think we need those kind of the broad policy frameworks that says, you know, this is what we need in terms of housing, and it's got to have the vision of people obviously well housed, but I think also living in supportive communities. So it's about that neighbourhood. Yes, houses are houses that people need to live in, but they need to be part of a neighbourhood where they feel well supported and connected. So if we talk about people's well-being, all of those things are important. But from region to region, we've got very, very different housing issues. We've got very different employment issues. And we've got some areas that where there's been a lot of emphasis, and we've got some areas where very little emphasis has been given. So I do believe that we need a regional strategy that is different from region to region. And I think you do see, I think we've seen it most because of our work in Marlborough. And Marlborough is a region of about 40,000 people. And currently we're supporting, gosh, it must be up to about 75 households now with housing in Marlborough for a very small area. And the big issue there is housing supply. It's just, and it's quite a recent issue where, I've forgotten how many years ago now, it's probably about 10 years ago, they were starting to sell off Housing New Zealand houses because it was considered there wasn't the demand for them. And it was only about kind of 2015 that things started changing, and people in the local soup kitchen were identifying that more people were coming through not being able to find housing. And a major report was done around that time for the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment about the labour needs, and identifying that as sheep farms were being converted to vineyards, there was going to be a lot more need for demand for labour. And so where was that labour going to come from? And what's really happened is with that demand for labour has come for the demand for the housing, and therefore the lack of housing, which is why we find that lots of the families who we work with have just tried numerous times to apply for a house to lease, but when they go, there's 20 or 30 people in front of them, and they just always get squeezed out the bottom. And it's simply a supply issue, and the best way of responding to that is we just need to get building more houses and ensuring that we've got the right levers to build more housing in Blenheim. So it's being able to look at what's happening in the region, look ahead. I think a really big issue we're not addressing is older people's housing. We see it here at Wesley Village. We've got 50 units here at Wesley Village, including an 8-room home for Kaumatua, which is more a shared living model based on kaupapa Māori principles. So we've got, 50 overall in Wesley Village, but we've got a waiting list of 60, and we have a turnover of 3 or 4 a year.
Right.
So, the demand is huge, but we're just not building affordable rental accommodation for people as they reach retirement. And all of the statistics show that we're going to need more and more of it, but I just don't see it happening. And I don't think that we have put the right levers in place to encourage people to build in this way.
Mm. So twice as we've gone through that, we've gone through a conversation and we've landed at this issue of supply, which I think is kind of, let's say, it's pervasive across our housing system, I think, but it's also an easy scapegoat, isn't it? So it's important, but it's also a scapegoat. And what I mean by that is, especially in your Marlborough example, you talked about MB having done some work. You talked about whether the local government, the local authority, was thinking about the right things. You talked about whether anyone was talking about and thinking about the future in an appropriate, let's say, strategic way. And you also talked about the idea that actually social housing was being sold off instead of retained, let alone added to. Yeah. So I guess what I'm asking you is what's your vision in that space apart from more supply? There's something more important that we need to be doing as communities, isn't there, to try and provide an opportunity for us to have better outcomes in 10 years' time?
It's the planning, it's the coordination, it's getting central government and local iwi with the community housing providers in the same room, saying what is it that we actually really need to build here and who's got the capacity to do it and with what resources. So I think it's not rocket science, but it's having a vision and having a plan, and that's what we're missing at the moment. It feels like lots is happening and it's already piecemeal. The Methodist Mission has got a number of different housing contracts. So in Blenheim, I think we're probably up to about 6 different housing contracts, so all little bits and pieces of the puzzle. But actually we need something that's far more strategic than that.
Someone was, it was Chris Glaudel mentioned the figure of something like 1.1 billion being invested in the public space and housing, and I can't be quoted on that because I didn't ask him to pull apart exactly what those figures were. In fact, I better delete that bit out of this recording. But actually Chris's point was, listen, if we're going to invest that much, then don't we really need to be ensuring that we're investing that in the right things? And I think that's probably something you're echoing here. Yeah. So, and I'm interested just in the in a segue to your where you ended, which was talking about aged care, and I think, frankly, I've only been in the local government space for probably 5 years, but the absence of significant investment in aged care accommodation has been an issue for at least that period of time.
Yep.
Are we still facing that? And what do you think needs to happen?
We just need to get building more. We need to be, I think what's happened is we've kind of let the private sector take over with all of these the Rymans, the Boopers, the Somerset retirement villages, and put those as the primary option for people when they retire. But the reality is that many people can't afford them. It's not a financial option for them. And so we need to do something different. And in the past, the City Council has had pensioner cottages and lots of that. I think what's happening a lot now is there's more demand for single accommodation. Well, if we look at the Otatahi Community Housing Trust here, it's not just retirement complexes or pensioner kind of cottages that they're responsible for because they're a registered community housing provider. They're taking people from the social housing register. So they'll be taking a lot of younger single people as well. So it's a different kind of model. So I think we haven't invested in the way that we have in the past in terms of providing villages of affordable rental properties.
Yeah, that's a very enticing issue, isn't it? Because it seems like a classic case of let's leave it to the market.
Yeah.
And I guess the market's done two things. It hasn't actually supplied to demand because it hasn't got an obligation to do that, right?
Yeah.
And it's also supplied for a particular market bracket, which isn't accessible to everybody, is it?
That's right. And the market has got to generate a profit for its shareholders.
Of course.
And we know that social housing doesn't, provide a dividend apart from a good social dividend. So yeah, that's our problem. If you had a big piece of land and you had some capital to build what Wesley Village is behind here, then we could fill it,
overnight.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, more housing across the spectrum, better supply. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah,
hey,
it is supply across the spectrum, because if you look at who's on the social housing register, it's a lot of single people or small families, maybe a solo parent with a one, maybe two children. So it's 1 or 2 bedroom where the highest demand is. There's also some need for large houses. We have a family in our transitional housing with 10 children, and they've been in our transitional housing for 2 years because we actually cannot find them a house that's actually big enough to meet their needs. So we need some at the other end of the spectrum as well.
And I guess that's what helps when you do some forward planning and some strategy. You get to understand what that demand might look like, and hopefully get close to delivering on it. So just quickly, and I'm not sure if this is within your area of expertise or not, but just a quick question on council, because we're talking about supply, and one of the big constraints, of course, in supply is land. And I just want to segue quickly to these ideas around the shift in the global sense, which is, I think one of the driving messages from the Shift film is that local authorities need to seriously think about retaining their land, not selling it. And certainly that's an issue in Auckland. And I guess, so I want to ask you, is that an issue in Christchurch? But I also understand that it's, so much of your land is compromised by the earthquake. It must be a real strain point, I think.
Yeah, I think.
So what I mean is that if we had a developer with $38 million to build a retirement home, is there land available? And
there's land available, and there's land available on the outskirts of the city, and you certainly see we've got a big Somerset village just opening up the road here. So there's certainly private companies who are buying up their land and building big rest home retirement complexes. Yep. So I think I don't think that's necessarily a problem. I think the problem with lots of the new land in the green space land is the covenants which developers are putting on it all, and so they're saying that in this particular area there will be no social housing, and I think we need to be making some requirements that any new development includes a certain amount of social housing, a certain amount of affordable housing in any development.
So they're using so something in your local environment is basically enabling the opposite of inclusionary zoning.
Absolutely.
Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I suspect it's the same throughout the country. In lots of developments where social housing is prohibited.
That's just terrifying, and I'm going to have to chase that down a rabbit hole at some point, I'm sure, Jill. Thanks for flagging that issue. Listen, so I'm pretty much ready to wrap up here.
Right.
But I've got a particular way of doing that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a bit of a wrap conclusion to our conversation. Not super confident that I'm going to be able to do it justice in a summary, but I'm going to do my best. And while I'm doing that, you're going to have a couple of minutes just to think about a 90-second pitch for your vision and what you think needs to change to get somewhere better in the next 10 years.
Wow. Okay.
And you can pick a piece of policy, you can pick a piece of something else. I'll leave that to you while I do my little wrap up. So kia ora everybody. Today in this one-on-one interview for the Shift Aotearoa, I've been talking with Jill Hawkey, who has provided some frankly extraordinary insights into I guess the housing scene in Christchurch, and really, as she's noted, more in the upper half of the South Island rather than just Christchurch. Thanks, Jill, for your awesome reflections on your organisation's experience during COVID, the special circumstance of Christchurch, and I look forward to talking to your colleagues and other people in the community of Christchurch, even the mayor, hopefully one day, about this kind of post-earthquake housing circumstance that you find yourselves in, which makes those circumstances quite unique in New Zealand, I think. So kia ora, I'm Brennan Rigby for the Shift Aotearoa. Thanks for tuning in. If you've tuned in, I hope somebody does. And thanks for checking out our website. You can follow us on Twitter at Shift Aotearoa. And so finally, to Jill Hawkey, who's taking us here and there on the housing system and some issues with it, I'd like to invite you to, in the spirit of Vision Week, even if it's not in Vision Week itself, to share with us your vision. And I recognise that you might have a multifaceted vision that you don't have time to do in 90 seconds, but a vision and in particular something that you think could really change, that would make a difference for our housing outcomes in Aotearoa.
Thanks, Brennan. I guess my vision is that within our communities, everybody is able to be housed in a warm, a secure and affordable home in which they're able to live, do the things that give their life meaning, and for families to be able to raise their kids in a place that's secure and good and is one of those givens that's not a worry for them. And I just think we need to give more emphasis to the fact of that housing takes part in communities. So what we want to do is we want to build good, strong neighbourhoods, not just houses. And I think as we look forward to increasing our housing supply, we need to be thinking about how we're doing that, ensuring there's spaces for kids to play, that there's green space, that there's community halls, all of those things which encourage social connectedness. And none of this is going to be able to happen unless two other things happen, and one is a good regional strategy that actually analyses what our current housing situation is region by region and looks at how we can respond in a kind of coordinated and joined up way. And that can only happen if we have really good national policy at the top to make that happen. So I guess it's at all levels that we need to be working. But at the end of the day, as we think about it, we need to be thinking about what's the result that we want for the families or the individuals or the older people who are actually going to live in these houses, and how can we ensure that they feel well supported. There we are, there's my 90 seconds.
Awesome, Jill. Thank you so much. I'm left, as I often am, on the one hand, I'm a very optimistic person and I feel very optimistic about the future. But boy, when you start hearing some of the gritty stories and some of the repeated challenges we find in the housing space, boy, it can suck up all of your optimism. But I think the underlying take-up for me is I've had a great time chatting with you. Today too. And yesterday, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Let us know if there's more things we can do as we go along.
I promise you, Jill, and to all of our listeners, that I'll continue to engage with Jill and your colleagues down in Christchurch, because there's a lot to talk about.
Lovely. Thanks,
all right.
Take
care. Jill. Talk
Bye.
again.
Bye.
Bye.